What makes a Warframe S tier? If I felt like being particularly pedantic today, I would say, being Saryn, I think the community has come to the consensus that Saryn is top dog. I agree with this, by the way. I don't think, however, that I've ever heard anyone discuss why Saryn is a peg above everyone else other than big damage. And, wow, quad scaling damage multipliers? Now, this is obviously a video about what makes a Warframe S tier. But I am going to play my trap card face up and admit that the video is more so about why a given Warframe may not be S tier. Let's talk about Saryn. She is acquired from the boss fight on Saturn, meaning she is acquired at the very end of the star chart progression, like I am talking at the very end. This makes sense, because if you max out range and efficiency, you now have a 40-meter nuke at the cost of 6 energy. This is to say that even with minimal investment, Saryn is completely busted for early game content. Early game is the start chart, with sorties being the introduction to the mid game, consisting of sorties, arbitration, 1 hour of an endless mission, and maybe even steel path incursions. The late game is the steel path, and the end game is... Anyways, I am not opening that can of worms. When we drop Saryn into the mid game, it's not like her spores suddenly stops being effective. As a matter of fact, they, without any support, still serves as an excellent damage ability, but when used in conjunction with her miasma, the spores deal 4 times more damage, and since the enemies will be inflicted with viral, assuming they have no shields, will be taking twice as much damage, effectively making the spores 8 times more effective for a grand total of 4 seconds. If the spores kill while miasma is active, they will spread to nearby enemies, or in other words, again, the point that I am getting at here is that Saryn bends the mid-game over her knee with 0 difficulty. You basically don't even need to bring a weapon if you have a proper setup for energy management. Now, when we get into the late game, that's when Saryn's spores finally fall off. Kind of. What I mean is that the 2-button nuke is no longer going to carry you. You actually have to learn to play the game at this point. However, it's not like the spores damage is a total non-factor, it's still going to net you some kills. On top of that, the spores continuously reduces the enemy's armor, which is one of the main pain points of early steel path. Her miasma may not be an instant nuke anymore, but it still stuns and doubles the damage taken on enemies in an unreasonably large area, which greatly benefits herself but also her team, making her suited for both solo play and team play. Speaking of which, Saryn has an augment that gives her spores late game relevancy, which she can share with her teammates. Not to mention that it's a combination element, so you don't risk tampering with your teammates' elemental setup. And these factors already make Saryn viable through all the major content in the game, and we still need to talk about her arguably best ability, Toxic Lass. Now, this ability is convoluted enough that it honestly deserves its own video, but today you'll just get the cliff notes. For this example, I'll assume that Saryn has 300% ability strength and that her weapon has 100% status chance. If she deals 100 damage with her weapon, she will deal an additional 90 toxic damage and apply a toxic proc, which will deal 225 damage over 5 seconds. So instead of dealing 100 damage, Saryn deals 415 damage. Now, if the enemy is also affected by a faction damage multiplier, this is where things get insane. Now the enemy takes 155 damage from the initial hit. Toxic Lass then deals 294 damage, which is multiplied again by the 55% faction damage, so it actually deals 456 damage. It then applies a Toxin proc that deals 1140 damage, except it multiplies with the faction multiplier again, causing it to deal 1767 damage. So instead of dealing 155 damage with Toxic Lass, Saryn dealt 2378 damage, and that's not even the end of it. All of this is to say that Saryn unironically has one of the best weapon platform abilities in the game, on top of being one of the most accomplished ability frames and having pretty good team support. Yes, her mold sucks ass, but that's exactly what you want. All her power is consolidated into 3 abilities, making her a prime candidate for the Helminth system, which I would argue is the most broken mechanic in the game. All of this makes Saryn the best in some game modes, one of the best in almost every game mode, and applicable basically in every single game mode. It's tough to look at any part of her kit and leverage any serious criticism towards it without being needlessly nitpicky and pointing at flaws which has no impact in a real mission. Now let's look at why most Warframes aren't S tier. And I just want to address the misguided idea that a Warframe's viability is dependent on how many different things they can do, since some of those things are by the very nature of them completely worthless. When someone feels slighted in the comments of one of my ranking videos because I didn't put their favorite on top, the most common argument I get basically boils down to, this Warframe can this and that and this other thing, and Inarus can heal himself by sucking his own dick for 5 minutes. For example, someone who's a fan of Saryn might argue that she's super duper overpowered because her prismatic gem primes the enemies for your entire team and gives you more status duration and status chance. And yes, this is something which Saryn can do, but what matters is how this actually affects the outcome of a mission. I would argue that the prismatic gem only primes enemies if they have been damaged by you or your team, and only one at a time. So it's only useful when your team commonly damages large hordes of enemies and then don't kill them for a while. So never. And in terms of high priority targets like bosses or demo lists, your team would most certainly prime those anyways. Now, that's not to say that I think that Prismatic Gem is a bad ability in cases where damage over time is your primary source of DPS. This is one of the better multipliers. For example, it greatly empowers a toxic Lash Saryn build as long as she stays inside this fairly forgiving radius. The point I am trying to make is that simply stating that a Warframe can do something does not make an argument for their viability. You have to state how their ability realistically can manifest in ways that contribute meaningfully to the completion of the objective of the mission, and also how widespread that use case really is. I would argue that Octavia could never be S tier. Yes, she really excels at solo survival, but bring her to defense or an interception and now she is just pretty good. Take her to a mission where you have to move around a lot. Now she is just okay. And so a Warframe that is most of the time just pretty good or just okay can't be S tier. Compare that to Styanics, who grants his team what I can only describe as infinite energy and total immortality while he is in combat using his intrepid stand. There isn't a state of the game where these effects are not incredibly useful, and so because of his almost omni-applicability, I would argue that he is S tier. Sure, he can also remove armor and group enemies, but these things comes at the cost of not using his ultimate, and so I consider them non-factors when assessing Styanics because they almost never manifest in a mission. In conclusion, when arguing for the viability of a Warframe, it's pretty disingenuous to argue for things they could maybe do under perfect conditions that never actually manifest in a real mission, or to compare the length of text of an ability and then going, look how overpowered this frame is, look at all this stuff they can do. And to answer the question of the title, what makes a Warframe S tier is their ability to contribute to the objective of the mission. Not the literal objective like surviving 5 minutes, but the actual objective of leaving with as much loot as possible, for example. Anyways, Inarus dick sucking tier list coming next.